Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight for the presentation from Chuck Currie. I just want to say thank you to some of our sponsors that have sponsored the summer conference. Many of those names you're going to recognize. And we wanted to acknowledge that we are presenting and attending and hosting this workshop from the land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. If you take a moment to look at the map to see where you are, it looks like Chuck is probably in the land of the Narragansett and not listed here, but in this section right here is the land of the Nipmuc, which is where I am currently located in Hopkinton and Upton area. There's also an interactive map that you can refer to at this address. This workshop is CEU available, and if you want to get credit for this workshop, you can just scan the QR code. I'll put that up again at the end of the presentation so that you can scan it into your phone. Okay, at this moment, I'd like to introduce Chuck from Freedom Food Farm. Chuck's going to tell us a little bit about himself and his farm and his practices, and specifically talking about growing organic greenhouse tomatoes for yield and flavor. I'm really looking forward to this, Chuck. Having visited your farm, you have quite a extensive greenhouse operation there. I'm looking forward to hearing all about your success. So without further ado, please go ahead and share your screen.
So, yep, as Chuck Currie, we run together with my partner Marie. We run Freedom Food Farm in Raynham, Mass, which was or is still Narragansett land. And actually, we're lucky to have a woman who worked at the farm before, and she just returned this year, and she's a descendant of the Narragansett tribe. So kind of cool to have her here. And so it's a 90-acre farm, about 30 miles south of Boston. Most people don't know where Raynham is, so just to give you an idea. We're producing about 4.5 acres of vegetables. We have 5 30 by 96 greenhouses. We also do some grain. We do a mix of livestock. We do some value-added products. Big point, I wish all presenters would tell us their soil type right off the bat, because that definitely affects what kind of management practices you're doing. So we have a loamy sand for most of our vegetable production, which is very, very sandy. That's sandier than a sandy loam. So that means it's very dry. It's hard to keep organic matter in the soil. Nutrient retention is pretty low as well. So those are just things that sometimes come into play with our management. We focus on year-round production. We have a small farm store at the farm where we sell a lot of our product. We have most of it is actually CSA pickup at the farm store, but we also sell to the public there. And then we do 2 winter farmers markets and 1 summer farmers market. To staff it, we have 5 year-round farmers, and then we have 2 people who are part-time. They work a couple months in the summer, and then we also have part-time or seasonal sales staff that help in the farm store. It's a little bit different this year with the pandemic, but that's generally what we do. This is our 8th year at our current location, 10th year in business. We were in Johnston, Rhode Island for 2 years before being able to find this amazing farm in Raynham that we started leasing in 2014. So there's the 2019 farm crew. We haven't taken our socially distant farm photo yet for this year, but this is last year's, because that's really the best part of the farm is the people that are there. The land is great, but the people are the best. All right, so greenhouse tomato production at our farm, just to give you an idea of how we do things and the scale and whatnot and what we're trying to do. So I've been growing greenhouse tomatoes for 16 years. I started at Red Fire Farm actually back in 2004. And then I started my own farm in Vermont in 2007, and before moving to this area. So, and I've done greenhouse tomatoes at all of those locations. It's always been something I really enjoyed and something I really like doing. I've been grafting for about 13 years. We grow about 3,000 square feet of tomatoes per season. About half of those are red slicers, and the other half are a mix of heirlooms and cherry tomatoes. We only graft our red slicers now. I'll go into that a little bit later when we talk about grafting. Right now, after all those years of grafting, we're actually buying in all our grafts for the first succession in our heated greenhouse. And then we usually pick those up first week of March and plant them mid-March. Again, I'll go into timing a little bit more. And then the later successions, we're growing our own plants and doing some grafting for later planted crops. So really our goal is to have tomatoes from late May through the end of October. And that's because, people love tomatoes. We're trying to get as many CSA members as we can. And we find it's like tomatoes, lettuce, cucumbers. That's what the top 3 things that people want. And so the longer we can have the tomatoes, the happier the CSA members are. And also if you're doing farmers markets, I think that's really important too, to be, that was something Ryan at Red Fire really drilled into me, is like, if you're the first person at the market to have something, they're usually going to keep buying from you the rest of the season. And also we found at our market that a lot of times, there's that initial rush of like when a crop comes in as the first thing, like everybody loves it and they're all into it. And then after it's been around for a month, they're kind of like sick of it and move on to the next thing. So if you can be the first person with tomatoes there, you're going to sell a lot of them the first few weeks. And then, by the time, later on in the season, by July, August, some people are kind of tomatoed out, and it's a lot harder to sell tomatoes in August compared to May and June, both from competition and also because people are, if they've been eating tomatoes, left and right all through June and July, then some of them are kind of sick of it by August. So, all right, so the types of structures, we exclusively grow them in metal frames, ledgewood greenhouses right now, but you can grow them in caterpillar tunnels or, less sturdy greenhouses. But this was my first greenhouse that I built when I was up in Vermont. We used this for starting seeds, and also we had, the 2 sides were for seeds, and we had a bed down the middle first year, and we grew grafted tomatoes in that bed in the middle. And we got a couple boxes of tomatoes a week, but it was a really nice addition in early June to have those tomatoes at the market as a first year farm. So even if you have something small like this and you're doing your starts in it, you can squeeze a few tomatoes in there. We did them right down the middle, so you had a lot taller area to grow them into. So briefly, I'll touch on the caterpillar tunnels. We were growing tomatoes in there when I first started. We used 1.5 by 20 foot Schedule 40 PVC bows, and then rope for a ridge. And then we also had ropes over the plastic to keep them down. We used rebars for posts. You look at the cost, it's $1,200 for a 10 by 150 foot caterpillar tunnel. That's a really low cost investment, especially if you're just starting out and you're renting land. You don't know, if you only have a 1 or 2 year lease, definitely something worth looking into. But if you have a longer term lease and looking to really stay in the game, I highly recommend getting a strong, sturdy greenhouse. There's a picture of what the caterpillar tunnels look like, closer up of how we vent the sides with these little, does my cursor work? Okay. With the little carpenter's clips, they call them, and then ropes over here to hold the greenhouse plastic from blowing around. Pros and cons, yeah, they're cheap and easy to move too, so you can keep, you don't have disease build up. You can move them from one section to the other. Definitely, fairly easy to harvest into, but yeah, they're easily destroyed by things like wind or bears, which more of a problem in Vermont than here. And also, if you go out there and try to fix one in a storm, please be careful of rebar flying around like nunchucks in the wind, because sometimes one piece of rebar will be stuck in the ground and the other one rips out, and then you have this rebar on the end of a 20-foot rope flying around in the wind, and it can get dangerous. So greenhouses and high tunnels or cold frames, the pretty much the same. Some people have slight differences in what they call one and the other, but we just pretty much just call them greenhouses at this point. Metal framed, anywhere from like 17 to 40 foot wide on average, 20 to 200 feet long. You can have a single or double layer poly. Yeah, you can use row cover in there and get a few degrees of protection if you don't have heat in there. So yeah, here is the first greenhouse we built at our farm in Raynham. This is a ledgewood greenhouse. I really do recommend, I can't recommend enough ledgewood for greenhouses. Ed is a great guy. He gives you lots of support. You can reach him on the phone. He's the owner. He'll talk to you, give you all sorts of advice. When he drops off the greenhouse, he gives you a lot of great advice. So for first timers, you can't beat it. I haven't looked lately, but his pricing has always been the best compared to all the other greenhouse companies out there. And one thing too, we've bought more greenhouses over the years, and we've stuck with ledgewood for, the reasons I mentioned before, but also I think continuity is really important, so that it's nice to have all your greenhouses be the same size, the same make, same model. It's a lot easier to, if you want to keep a couple extra rolls of plastic on hand, if they fit all your greenhouses, it's a lot more easy to do, all the parts and knowing how to build them. If you built one, then the next one's built the same. If you switch companies or switch sizes or whatever, it becomes a little difficult to figure out, the differences between them. So the other thing about this greenhouse is that we ordered it 1 foot taller than the normal size, and I really recommend that because the tomatoes grow really tall, and the more space, vertical space you have, the easier it is to grow them. The less you have to lower them, the less often the fruits are going to end up on the ground because you have to lower the tomato plants because they're up hitting the roof. You also have more air volume in there, so it holds the heat better if you're not heating. And yeah, I really recommend that. You can get them 2 or 3 feet taller than normal as well. You just have to let Ed know. But the caveat is, for every foot taller you go with the greenhouse, you have to pound your post an extra foot into the ground. So remember that, especially if you have rocky soils or whatever. If you want a 2 or 3 foot taller greenhouse, you're going to be pounding those posts 5 feet into the ground, which can be a chore. All right, so yeah, again, things to consider. Bigger, taller is always better. Wider, is great. You have less edge effect, which is like that cold air coming in from the sides. You have a lot more volume, more room for the plants to grow. You don't have to lower them as much. And for tomato growing, you want north to south orientation. So that allows you, when you have those sides rolled up, you're getting the east to west wind whipping through the greenhouse, which gives you much more better air circulation. So you have a lot better disease control, and you won't have as many disease issues, basically. You won't have as much heat issues as well. Like, there's some things that are caused by excessive heat in the greenhouse, and that will really help to alleviate that issue. When you're building the greenhouse, keep in mind, try to find a good grade. Think about what soil type you have. Well drained is a lot better. Think about snow removal down the road. You want to make sure you keep the snow away from there, so it doesn't collapse if you have a really bad snowstorm. Although Ed has told us that those greenhouses are engineered to hold 1 foot of ice. So that's 12 inches of solid ice they're engineered to hold. So theoretically, it's not an issue, but if you're starting to plant your greenhouse tomatoes first week of March and you have 6 feet of snow around them, you're going to have to do something to get that snow out of the way. And if you have room around the greenhouse, it's a lot easier to clear that snow than if it's greenhouse upon greenhouse with 6 feet space in between. You got to think about your ventilation too, whether you're going to have passive or active ventilation, fans, or you're just going to have roll-ups. Ridge vents, I'm a big fan of ridge vents. We don't have any here at the farm for a number of reasons, but I think they're really great. If you have the time and money to install them, I highly, highly recommend getting ridge vents. But mostly we just have roll-up sides. We don't use fans mostly because we're trying to cut down on our fossil fuel usage and our electrical usage. So the roll-ups have worked okay for us, but you know, a roll-up ridge vent combination I think is ideal for, especially for growing greenhouse tomatoes. It allows all that warm air on the top of your greenhouse to just leave, and then all the cool air comes in from your roll-up sides, and you also get a lot more airflow that way if you have a somewhere spot on top to let the heat out. You can also have a vent on your gable ends, like on the top of your end walls. That'll help also, but a ridge vent is really the way to go, I think. And then, you know, you also might want to consider some ground insulation around the edges if you're growing really like early, starting them early in the season. And then I can't recommend enough, skirts. So those are just, I believe I could show you in a picture later on, but that's basically just having like a 2 or 3 foot knee wall. Some people call them knee walls of plastic around the edge of the greenhouse. And so that really helps a couple things. One, it helps your roll up make a seal when you close it up. You can have an overlap of a foot or two between where your roll up goes down and your skirt comes up, and that seals it from wind blowing in. Also, early in the season, you get a lot of wind still in March and April. And so if you don't have a skirt and you just planted these greenhouse tomatoes and they're only a foot or two tall, the wind whipping through there can really do a number on them. And so that skirt, you know, if it's 2 feet tall, it protects the plants while they're getting off to a start. And oftentimes before they're trellised, we don't trellis until about 2 weeks in. So they really protect. And then you also want to think about your heating. What are you going to use for heat? Propane, oil. You're going to heat the air and the soil, or typically if you're going to just heat one, it's the air. Some people just heat the soil, but I think if you're going to choose one, I would go with air. But ideally, you're heating the air and the soil. But we actually only heat the air, just you know, another infrastructure upgrade we just haven't gotten around to. And also with our lease situation, it's a significant investment to do soil heat in a greenhouse. So, but for those early tomatoes, it really does make a big difference if you can heat the soil somehow. All right, so pros and cons for greenhouses. They really are super sturdy structures. With the weather in New England and the climate crisis, I really recommend getting a nice, strong, sturdy greenhouse. Those caterpillar tunnels, they blow away really easily, and it's not fun to be chasing those big rolls of plastic around the field or losing crops because you got a windstorm right before a frost. You know, nice sturdy structure pays for itself, especially if you can get an NRCS grant. They have pretty good insulation value, especially if you have a double layer of poly compared to a caterpillar tunnel. And like I said, with those skirts, you get some nice sealing effect, and you can seal them up a lot tighter than a caterpillar tunnel. It is a fairly permanent structure, so you can run water and electric in there. I really recommend doing that. If you're going to be doing heated greenhouse tomatoes, you got to have some sort of frost-free hydrant inside the greenhouse, and you got to have some sort of electricity to run your heater and also your ventilation fans. There is, you know, a fairly significant cost. It's, you know, for $9,000 is the bottom, you know, that's the minimum you can spend to have a 30 by 96 single layer. But, you know, you're talking 15,000 plus, depending on whether you're running your own water and electric or not, and what you're doing for temperature controls and heaters and all that, if you're going to go with a double layer heated greenhouse. I will say though, NRCS right now is reimbursing at about $14,000 for 30 by 96. So that definitely leaves you some wiggle room in there to either pay yourself to install it or to go with some extras like automated roll-ups and such. All right, so the downsides though to a greenhouse like that is they're not mobile. You can have disease and pest buildup issues if you're not careful, and also fertility issues, salt issues building up, things like that. So you do have to be a little more careful, or you need to move them every 5 or 10 years. All right, so variety selection. So your biggest consideration really should be your markets. You know, what if you grow a variety that has a great yield, but you can't sell that variety, then what good is it? So you really want to know what you can sell at your market. Do people buy heirlooms? Do they buy slicers? Do they buy cherry tomatoes? They buy all of them? None of them? You know, you want to find those things out before you make big investments and big changes on your farm. I say yield and disease resistance is kind of secondary, because, you know, what's the point of having lots of beautiful tomatoes if you can't sell them? So the greenhouse tomatoes for red slicers are kind of always coming in and out of vogue. Buffalo was the one that everybody liked for a while. It has great flavor, but they cracked. You can actually, through Fedco though, you can get a stabilized variety that some small, I forget their name, but there's a smaller breeder that took the Buffalo type and they bred it, and because it originally was a hybrid, and they bred it to be fairly stable, and I believe it's called Baziki, and that we're trialing that this year, so we'll see how it goes. We have been doing Geronimo for a number of years. That you get great disease resistance, barely have any cracking. Actually, I don't think I've seen any crack this year. The yields are just incredible, and however, they just stopped making it this year. Some people still have it if you can find it, an older stock, or some farms, like the farm where we get our starts, Walker Farm, he froze, you know, he has like 5 years worth of Geronimo seed in his freezer, and so he just will keep growing Geronimo until he finds something he likes, and then eventually switch over once the Geronimo seeds are used up. We were using Arbison for a while. That's an organic variety, and we tried that instead of Geronimo because Geronimo was actually owned by Seminis, which was bought by Monsanto. So that is an issue. You know, you're buying seed and supporting Monsanto, for those of you who don't want to support Monsanto. But there's really a lack of good organic varieties by small seed companies in the red slicing market. So it's, you know, that's kind of an issue right now. Some of the ones that are up and coming that are replacing Geronimo that we seem to like, Frederick seems like it has some promise. Rebelski, I think, is the best one and closest Geronimo right now. I think the flavor is a little bit better, and it still has the good disease resistance and the yield. However, again, I believe that's a Seminis variety owned by Monsanto. Tomimaro Mishu, we're trying that this year. A lot of growers like it. And it also, I believe it came in 3rd place for the Massachusetts tomato contest for flavor. So that, you know, for a greenhouse tomato to be up there in the flavor contest, that's pretty good. So I think that has some promise. Then of course you have your regular heirlooms you can grow in the greenhouse. They do a lot better in the greenhouse than in the field. They might not taste quite as good, but you have way less disease issues. It's a lot easier to monitor and control the environment, control the amount of water they're getting, things like that. And now there's also a number of heirloom imposters, I call them, which are basically hybrids that, you know, you can buy it through Johnny's, and I believe High Mowing has them now too, that they look like heirlooms, but they're not, and they're kind of more bred for greenhouse conditions. So you're going to have higher disease resistance. You're going to have, you know, better yields, I think, but, you know, they look like heirlooms. They probably don't taste quite as good as heirlooms, but I think you'd have to have a fairly discerning heirloom aficionado to tell the difference. So for your average market goer, I think you can get away with growing those for people who want heirlooms, but you might struggle to grow heirlooms inside because they are a little more finicky. For greenhouse cherries, we've really settled on these few varieties. We've tried a lot. We've tried the Torrangino, we've tried Bartelli. The Torrangino's cracked and didn't have good taste. The Bartellis were whitefly magnets, and also they cracked and the taste wasn't great. So we like Estorino, which is a yellow one, and that's actually we won first place in the cherry tomato category for the Massachusetts Tomato Contest with Esterina. And you know, when I first started growing that and tasted it, I was like, this is going to win the contest someday. And first time we entered it, it won first place. So, you know, that's great tomato. It's a yellow. Montesino is a grape tomato. We won third place with that one. I really like the flavor on that. Sakura is a red cherry. They're a little bit bigger than normal reds, but, you know, great flavor, great disease resistance, great yield, really great variety. And we've gone to Sun Gold for the golden. We've tried some of the other specific ones for greenhouse, and they just, none of them had the flavor that the Sun Golds had. So we still sticking with that Sun Gold, although new ones come out every year that are supposed to replace Sun Gold, but I haven't found one that tastes as good. We do black cherry. That's older. It might be an heirloom even, just because I really like the flavor. It seems to do well in the greenhouse, and it's a different color. We like to have a mix of cherries. Indigo cherry drop. That's another different color. The flavor is pretty good. Does well in the greenhouse. It's a newer variety, but it seems to do pretty well. And between all those 6 varieties, you get a really nice, stunning display of cherry tomatoes. All right, so for grafting, after years of experimentation of grafting heirlooms and grafting cherry tomatoes, we've decided it's really only worth grafting red slicers. That may be different for the heirloom imposters. I haven't grown any of those, so it's possible that those could benefit from grafting. But we found that the heirlooms, when we grafted them, they had more disease issues. They just didn't do as well. The taste wasn't as good. Yeah, so we just figured it wasn't worth it. And for the cherry tomatoes, we didn't really see that much of a difference between grafting them and not grafting them. So it just wasn't really worth it. Really when you graft tomatoes, you're grafting them onto older, more wild style tomatoes, and cherry tomatoes are already more closely related to the wild ancestors of tomatoes. And so that's why I think the cherries just don't benefit as much as these newer hybrid greenhouse tomatoes that have been so far selected for their the scions, for the good flavor and good yield and all that, that those really benefit from grafting. We use almost exclusively Estamino rootstock that is supposed to gives you higher disease resistance, more vigor. That's what you want, is you want the vigor and the disease resistance. So it keeps growing throughout the season. Because if you want to harvest from May to the end of October, you need that vigor that you're not able to get from the scion roots. Fortamino is one that's supposed to be for cooler, unheated greenhouses, and we have used it there, and it seems to maybe do a little bit better than Estamino, but we haven't seen a huge difference. It's also possibly they say it gives you a little more. For people who are having trouble, I think, getting generative plants, it's supposed to give you a more generative plant, where the Estamino helps you more be more vegetative. I'll go into that a little bit more later too. And then MaxiFort that was the industry standard. However, it seems they're phasing it out and going to this new one, Xinjiang. And MaxiFort was another Seminis variety, and I believe this new one is probably also owned by Seminis. So if you're trying to avoid, again, supporting Monsanto, you can go with the Estamino. Top graft versus side graft. We do the top. I've tried side grafting, have not had much luck. The top graft seems way easier. I'm not going to get really deep into grafting here, but you can look up those 2 types. I highly recommend the top graft over the side graft. And so again, this could be a whole nother workshop, grafting tomatoes, but if you want to learn how to graft tomatoes, 2 best resources. One, if you go on YouTube, Johnny Seed's YouTube channel, and type in how to graft greenhouse tomatoes, you'll get this older video with Michael Collins, who runs Old Athens Farm up in Vermont, just outside of Brattleboro. And Vern Grubinger is filming it, and UVM produced it, and it is a great, great video, great resource. I can't say enough. As far as I'm concerned, I've visited a lot of farms, and Michael Collins seems to be the best organic tomato grower in the Northeast. Pretty much everything I've learned about tomatoes, I learned from him, either asking him questions or going to his farm for workshops, or just showing up there and helping out for a day in exchange for asking a bunch of questions. So it's a great way to learn. And then another great resource is Johnny's Growers Library. They have, there's another fact sheet also I'll add, I'll talk about later, but they have a worksheet called Top Grafting Tomatoes, and it has pretty much everything you need to know about top grafting tomatoes. So really, those two resources, you can teach yourself how, and start in a lot of trial and error. You can teach yourself how to graft. We found that really it's easier and cheaper to buy them in, unless you need 100 or 200 plants or more. The issue is that you really need, they have to match up. Your scion and your rootstock have to match up. The scion is the top of the plant you're growing for the fruit. The rootstock is the plant you're growing for that vigor and disease resistance. And they have to be exactly the right size when you graft them. That's the thing about the downside to top graft, is it's a little more finicky about the scion and the rootstock being the same size when you graft them. The side grafts are a little more forgiving of that, but I don't think enough that it's worth doing side grafting. So, you have, if you want 100 plants, you kind of have to start 200 seeds, or 200 scions and 200 rootstocks to get 100 grafts, just in case they don't match up. If you're doing 500 plants, you probably only need 600 or 700 of each to get 500 plants. So it really, you have a economy of scale there, where if you're doing a lot of plants, it makes sense. If you're just doing a few, it can be tough to really hit that nail on the head with the scions and the rootstocks being the same size. So, and then the other thing is, you have to start those things. If you want to plant them in March, you're starting them in January, and it costs a lot of money to heat a greenhouse in January, or you have to have an indoor growing space, and then they just don't do as well with not natural light. They kind of get leggy and it's difficult. So, I think it's worth the money to buy them in. Old Athens Farm, Michael Collins, last time I spoke to him, he said he is doing plants for sale again. He was doing them for a while, and then he wasn't, and then it sounds like he is again. And then Jack Mannix at Walker Farm in Dummerston, Vermont, he does a great job, and he's a little bigger scale, and he has, he sells tomato plants to a lot of growers in the area. So I recommend contacting him as well if you want to buy in some plants. There's also a lot of other places. I'm sure there's other farms I don't know of that are doing a good job. One thing I'd advise against, though, is buying in from one of those big box, or one of those big places in California. Also the same thing with Johnny's. They're getting them from those big places in California. And I've just heard horror story after horror story of powdery mildew coming in, or just, I've seen the plants that come in, they're all leggy and gross and weird, and disease and pest issues. And it seems like those larger growers out there are just, they don't have it down, and they're not really, they don't have to look someone in the face that they infected their greenhouse with powdery mildew. They don't have to run into them at a conference later on. So it seems like they're not quite as worried about ruining someone's greenhouse growing season. So again, also plus the big thing is buy local, support local farms, right? And then, so one just other thing about grafting is really the key is the healing and acclimation. It's making sure you acclimate them properly. Again, that Johnny's fact sheet has all the information on that, but you have to basically gently reintroduce them to a less humid environment and to light. I'm going to end it there with grafting. I should mention, though, if anybody has any questions, feel free chime in, raise your hand, whatever, because really I'm trying to help people grow tomatoes. So if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them as we go. All right, so a couple of tools for grafting. We use this grafting knife that's really nice because it helps you get an even cut each time you cut them. It's available through Johnny's. And you want a sharp blade. These are the top grafting clips you get, again, available through Johnny's, or High Mowing carries them now as well. I recommend buying like 3 different sizes and having them on hand and keeping them in a little mason jar so you can hopefully keep the dirt off. Obviously, we didn't do a great job with this one, but the less dirt you have on them, I think the better the grafts are going to do. This is our healing chamber that we use. We have a workbench on top to do the grafting. And then once they're grafted, they go underneath there. And we have this thick tarp that keeps the sunlight off and keeps them dark. That's what the inside looks like. It's insulated with rigid insulation, and it's sealed up. So that rigid insulation, not only are you insulating it to keep it a constant temperature, but that's also acting as a vapor barrier. So you're able to keep the humidity really high in the healing chamber. So that's really key if you're going to do grafting, is having a good good healing chamber with constant humidity and constant temperature. And then once we've done grafting, they can be a little flimsy. So when we pot them up into 4-inch pots, we use a bamboo stake or a skewer you can get from the grocery store, and a little tomato clip to kind of keep them from flopping over. Just an idea for your schedule. If you're trying to do grafting, you kind of want to do them every 3 days, because it's important to have them to match up. So, if you're seeding them every 3 days, chances are you're going to have some plants that will match up, some rootstock that will match up with a scion. So we've also found that rootstock in general, they grow faster, but they germinate a lot slower. So some sources will tell you to seed the scion first. I find that you want to seed the rootstock first. So just, brief idea, you start some rootstock on February 1st, then every 3 days, start doing rootstock and scion, and then maybe the last one do scion. But really, you should seed a few of each variety ahead of time and see how long each one takes to come up, and then plan it based off of that. It's going to take you about 6 to 10 weeks to have a plant ready to plant. It's a lot longer than when you're not grafting, because you have that healing time. So keep that in mind. If you're doing grafting for the first time, I'd see double of what you need, because you don't want to have a whole bunch of rootstock and no scions to match them up to, or vice versa. And then what we do is, whichever seed is cheaper, we seed a lot more of that one, and then the expensive ones we just seed a few to make usually the scions for the red slicers are a lot more expensive, so we seed like a couple more scions than what we need, and then seed a whole bunch of rootstock, and then that way there's always going to be some rootstock that'll match up to the scion. But if you're doing like heirlooms, I know the heirloom seed is cheaper than the rootstock seed, so just keep that in mind when you're seeding a whole bunch. All right, so general seeding and planting dates for grafted and non-grafted. So again, if you're doing grafted red slicers, you want to probably get them in the ground earlier rather than later. So when we do graft, we start them around January 20th for a 3/15 planting date. For ones that we're not grafting, for cherries, we're seeding more first week of February for that same mid-February planting date, or mid-March planting date. And then with our heirlooms, we usually start mid-March, plant them early May. That's because our markets, there isn't a huge demand for heirlooms, so we don't see much value in spending a lot of money heating heirlooms to have them early, because they just don't sell well enough to justify that. And then we're kind of doing a late succession that we're seeding mid-May, planting late June, and that kind of makes sure that if we have disease or pest issues in the early plantings, we'll still have some tomatoes going into October to keep everyone happy. So again, though, always remember, it depends on your markets. When can you sell tomatoes, what types you can sell, and then your infrastructure. If you don't have a heated greenhouse, then you're going to be changing this, obviously, or if you don't have a market, if your market ends in September, there's no point in doing a late market or late seeding. Or, if your market doesn't start till July, there's no point in planting your tomatoes in March. Bed prep. So we've gone to a no-till system in our greenhouses and most of the field as well. So now we pretty much, during the winter, we don't do it every year, but we found that we have a really great success if we put a bunch of leaves, and we have chickens in the greenhouse for like a month in the winter. It adds a lot of fertility, a lot of organic matter, gets rid of all your pests. There's not a single aphid or anything. So you're going in with a clean slate. And then usually, sometimes we'll broad fork if the chickens really got it compacted. But if we didn't do chickens, we don't do broad forking. Like this past season, we didn't broad fork. We just had the beds that were already made from our winter greens, and we went in there and I just spread compost over the top and I planted. That was it. I didn't broad fork. I didn't rake. I saved a lot of time. And I think, once you have the fertility where you need it, then that's the way to go. You don't have to, we have enough fertility in the soil that we don't need to broad fork to incorporate fertility lower into the soil. So that's what we do now, just plant them pretty much. But you want to make sure you have a fair bit of fertility in the soil when you plant. Also want to make sure the bed is moist when you plant. You don't want to be planting into a super dry soil and then trying to play catch up with your irrigation. We also, prior to planting, this is another tip from Michael Collins, is we put out all the plants in the pots on top of the bed, pretty much where they're going to be. So before we plant, they're spending 4 to 7 days, right where they're going to be, but not in the ground. And so that kind of eases them a little bit more. They have a little bit less transplant shock because they're getting used to being, that temperature and that microclimate on the ground, but they're not having the transplant shock of being in this larger soil area that has, maybe not as much water and maybe not as much nutrients as your potting soil. So that kind of helps to acclimate them a little bit better to do that. All right, and then, so if you're spacing, pruning, and trellising, again, Johnny's Grower Library has some great resources. I used to, spend a lot of time trying to figure all this stuff out, and then suddenly I realized that all of the information I was looking for is all on these great 3-page fact sheets Johnny's puts out. So it's called Greenhouse Tomato Pruning and Trellising Recommendations. You can Google that or go on their website. Highly recommend having that, laminate it, and stick it in the greenhouse. You will be referencing it fairly often, I think, if you're starting out. We do 6-foot on center beds. We're doing one row per bed, one plant every 20 to 22 inches, and then we're pruning each plant to 2 liters. I really, can't emphasize it enough. More plants does not equal more tomatoes. It usually equals just more pruning and trellising work, more disease issues, more pest issues. This is the spacing. They've done the research. This is the spacing you want. Don't, I really recommend just going with that recommendation there. So, and then trellising, you need really strong trellis wires. Don't go with something flimsy and have it break in the middle of the season. It will be a mess. We use high tensile fence wire. I believe it's 16 gauge. It's pretty strong wire. And then you can also use high tensile fence tensioners on either side to tension it. And then make sure your end walls or whatever you're securing that trellis to is really strong. This is also where if you have cross ties, that helps because some of the weight of the trellis wire is sitting on the cross ties, and that helps alleviate the pressure from your end walls. And so there's 2 trellis wires per bed, and that's because there's 1 for each liter. So each one of those plants, as you prune it to 2 liters, 1 liter is going on one trellis wire, and the other liter is going on another trellis wire on the other side. So they're forming a V going up. You don't want to have them all in line on the same trellis wire because you won't get as much airflow. You won't get the sunlight penetration that you need. You really need that V situation. So, if you look above, our trellis wires are pretty much all evenly spaced from one bed to another. So all our trellis wires are 3 feet apart, but then the plants are 6 feet apart if you look, from the bottom. So you're pruning for airflow, you're pruning for disease control, and you're pruning for ease of harvest. A big key to organic tomatoes and having that disease control is removing any diseased or dying leaves. As soon as you see anything on those leaves, like, a little bit of alternaria or, mildew or whatever it is, you got to get that leaf out of there, and you pull it off the plant, you put it in a bucket, and you get it, far enough away that the spores aren't going to be blowing in. So like, I recommend like a quarter mile away, and we try to like bury them. After tomato pruning, we have a huge pile of leaves in the compost pile, and then I try to turn that in as soon as possible so that it's not just being this giant resource of disease spores and fungus spores that are going to blow right back in your greenhouse. So that's number one thing for disease control is sanitation in your greenhouse. Just getting any bit of leaf, or anything that falls on the ground, dead leaf or whatever, pick it up, get it out of the greenhouse as soon as possible. Don't leave them on the ground. I can't stress that enough. And then also you want to prune a fair bit of the lower leaves so you get some airflow underneath your plants. And you don't, you really need that airflow below the leaves and above the leaves to properly dry them off and avoid disease. Now, we also prune our fruit clusters to 3 to 4 fruits per cluster. In general, you're going to get the same weight per cluster, no matter how many fruits are on there. So again, though, that kind of depends on your market. So if you have a market that wants smaller tomatoes, then you can leave 5 or 6 fruits per cluster. That's fine. If you have a market that really likes, the big uniform tomatoes, then you probably want to prune them all to about 4. We try to prune them before the tomatoes get to about dime size. And we also leave them on there until they're to like a dime or a quarter size, because, you might have 6 tomatoes on there. And then if you pull them off right as they're flowering, the extra 2, by the time they start sizing up, maybe you realize one of them is damaged, or one of them, you have an issue with one of those fruits when they're really small. So by waiting until they're like quarter to dime size, then you can pick and choose which ones you're keeping. And if one got like scratched up because it rubbed against the trellis wire or something, then you can pull that one off and leave the ones that aren't damaged or aren't oddly shaped or something. And then for trellising, there's the tomato clips that I think most people are familiar with that you saw earlier on the grafted tomato. And then what we really recommend and have switched to and has been life-changing is the clipper system. I'll show you that, but you also got to, because mainly you want to remember, not only are you holding those tomatoes up with your trellis system, you also need to have a way to lower your greenhouse tomatoes as they get taller and taller. Especially the longer season you're growing the tomatoes, the more important it is to have some sort of lowering system. All right, so as they're starting off, here you can see the tomato clip right there, and we're using regular tomato twine when they're this small. The top of that tomato twine is tied to the rod from our clipper system, which I'll show you in a little bit. And you can also see this is starting to split into 2 leaders. And that leader you want to keep, so you're always keeping the main growing point, the main leader, and then the first sucker that grows is below the first group of cluster of flowers here. Then that's the one that you want to keep for your second leader. So again, always remember, find your first cluster of flowers and go below it, and then that's your first leader. That leader is always going to be the strongest leader. You don't want to keep one from down here. You don't want to keep it from down there. You want that first one below the first cluster of flowers. Here's a better close-up of that. Again, it's that first leader that's coming out. Actually, it was right. That was the leader, I believe, or the sucker that became a leader. And then you're going to get that nice even V shape where the sucker and the leader are about the same height. You don't want a lopsided plant where your sucker is a lot lower than your leader. That can cause issues later on. So again, yeah, it's really key to make sure you have that one. Make sure if you have help in the greenhouse that they know not to sucker off that first leader. All right, and then once they get a little taller, this is the clipper system. So this steel rod here, it's got a hook on the top and it hooks to your trellis. And the good thing about that is you can move the you can move it around forward and back in the trellis as you need it. It's not fixed on there like if you tied a piece of tomato twine. It's really easy to move. And then you have these, you have these clips here that grab onto the tomato, and they really hold on there a lot better than those tomato clips. The tomato clips we find under the weight, we usually put like 5 or 6 clips on there by the time you're done to hold all the weight. And then when you go to lower it, you have to unhook 5 or 6 clips, and it can be a total mess. But it's just 2 clipper clips are enough to hold that tomato. And when you're ready to lower it, all you do is you take that bottom clip and you squeeze it, and you take it off, and then you take this top clip and you squeeze it, and it releases the pressure on your steel rod there, and you just lower the plant to the bottom. You take that clip that you had taken off the bottom and you put it back on the top, and you've just lowered it. That's it. No jug. If you've ever tried to do it with the other tomato clips, you're like trying to hold the stem with one hand and unclip with another hand and hold it upright and keep the thing from flopping over. If you're growing tomatoes for more than 3 or 4 months in a greenhouse, it pays for itself in 1 year, having to use this system. So I highly recommend it. This is what the clip looks like. This one's a little haggard, but it's got these little pieces that fit around the metal rod, and then it's got the sponge that goes around the tomato stem. And you can buy, these are like 3 separate things you buy: the sponge, the clip, and then there's a metal rod that this clips to. So you can replace the sponge, after a few years, or some people replace them every year if they're worrying about disease issues. But we've been using them for 4 or 5 years and haven't replaced them yet. So this is, what a nicely trellised greenhouse looks like. You can see the rods going up and down here to the, you have 2 trellis wires per bed. Everything is nice and uniform. You have just enough space to get down there and do your harvesting. But, there's about the same amount of space from this plant to the other, from leader to leader within a bed as from one bed to another. You kind of want even spacing to make the most of your sunlight. Maybe you have a little bit more space in the aisles, but, you want to have them evenly spaced and a lot of space in between the 2 leaders to get some more airflow, and also to let that sunlight in. That's Flat Stanley that we were taking pictures of around the farm for a elementary school project, but he was helping trellis there. And this is the bottom of that steel wire, or the steel rod for the clipper system. And until the plants are tall enough to reach that steel rod, we just use tomato twine, and then there's a little tomato clip down there. All right, and then when they're fully, they're up there and you're starting to lower them, this is what they look like. So you can see the bottom, this is where the initial V was, and you've seen we've already harvested about 4 clusters of tomatoes off there. This was taken, I think, yesterday. And so, you really have to start lowering them. And so you can see where this would be an issue, where if you still have tomatoes down here, and you're lowering them, they're going to be sitting on the ground, getting eaten by slugs, things like that. Because if your greenhouse is a foot or 2 shorter, then the ground, these are going to be sitting on the ground. And so it really helps to have that taller greenhouse. And then one thing we've learned from, this was a tip from Andrew Mefford. He actually has a great book out called Greenhouse Growers Handbook, or Organic Greenhouse Growers Handbook. That's a great resource as well. And he's recommended the carousel system of lowering, and this is where those metal rods come in handy too. So each time we lower, we're moving this metal rod one way or the other. So you can see the front row, we're moving to the left. Each time we lower it, we move it to the left. And the one in the back, each time we lower it, we're moving it to the right. And so that way, as the stem gets longer and longer, it starts to lay down and goes in that direction. Whereas if you're not moving this leader to the left each time you lower it, you start to have all these stems building up, and they kind of start to come out, and So like the stem would come out and it would come into the aisle and then it would come back like this, and it would really start to get in the way. So by having those stems go laterally in the row as you lower them, it helps keep them out of the way. So, or they also call it a racetrack system. So, there's lowering and the stems going that way on this leader, and then the leader on the other side, you're lowering them and moving them that way. And so it's kind of like a racetrack going around like that. So that helped us out a lot with the stems in the aisle situation. All right, so irrigation, drip, 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 that's the way to go. Overhead irrigation, you're just asking for disease issues, also not as efficient. We do 4 lines per bed. We keep them really close right after planting because you got to remember those roots haven't spread out much yet. So it's really important to keep them right on top of the plant so they get enough water. And then as the roots develop, we space them out further. If you go back here, you can kind of see, we're spacing them out about a foot apart. So we're trying to, that way you want to wet the whole bed area so they have more area to pull nutrients from and water from. We water about 1 to 2 hours a day. It depends on how much heat there is, how much sunlight there is. We do a little bit more for the first week or 2 after transplanting and make sure they get established. They also have, you can get timers to automate your watering system. That's probably worth it. Michael Collins has these sunlight meters that they measure the amount of sunlight that comes in each day, and then it meters out the water based on the amount of sunlight for the day. So for a real cloudy day, it doesn't water much, and it's a really sunny day, it waters more, and you don't have to worry about adjusting any of your timers or turning things on and off at a different time. So, automation probably starting to get, I'd say, is definitely worth it. And then a little more about that generative versus vegetative growth. So it's really a balancing act throughout the greenhouse cycle of trying to keep. Generative is basically that's like reproductive growth. So you want to keep producing more and more flowers as the season goes on, so that you can keep picking tomatoes. But you also need to stay vegetative enough so that it doesn't, just produce all flowers, then kind of fizzle out, and you get those really thin stems, and then the plant is not really producing. You're not getting that long-term vigor, and you're not producing more fruit clusters and more stem and whatnot. So you got to keep that balance. And to measure that, ideally, you want the stem to be 2 centimeters thick, 20 centimeters from the growing point. So you can get Michael Collins walks around with a caliper in his back pocket, and he's measuring once in a while how thick the stems are, and he's adjusting accordingly. So the way to adjust that, if you have, if it's too generative and you have these really thin stems and lots of fruits but not much leaf growth, then you need to add more nitrogen. You need to water more. You need to change the differential between night and day temps. So either lowering the temp that you're venting at or raising your heater at night if you're heating. And then, so those are things that help with vegetative growth. And then if you're having too much vegetative growth and you want to encourage vegetative growth, generative growth, then those are do things like adding more phosphorus, reducing your nitrogen intake, having drier soil, or pretty much any stresses will cause it to be more generative. A higher differential between night and day temps. Also, excessive day temps, that's temps, will cause generative growth. Stress will cause generative growth. High fruit load will also cause generative growth. So you kind of just got to keep an eye on that. Generally, we find right after planting, it's very vegetative, and we're doing everything we can to keep it from being too vegetative. So right after we plant, we're only side dressing with phosphorus, no nitrogen. We're lowering the nighttime temps. Briefly about temperatures. You don't want it to be below 60 degrees at night, ideally. If you have the heat and the weight and the capacity to heat your greenhouse, do not let it get below 60 degrees. You're really asking for trouble with funguses and powdery mildew and things like that. So don't go below 60, but I would lower it to 60 if you're having a lot of nitrogen or a lot of vegetative growth issues. And then you don't really want to go past 68 at night, but somewhere in there between 60 and 68, depending on what your how vegetative or generative your plants are. You want to be in that window. And then during the day, ideal temperatures are about 70 to 75 degrees. So again, if you have the capacity to have a automated ventilation system, or you're heating early in the season, you want to keep that between 70 to 75. You're not really getting much extra growth beyond 75 degrees. You're just wasting propane at that point. And then, and also much beyond 80, you definitely want to be venting before it gets higher than 80 in there, because you're just adding additional stress that is not going to really help the plant grow. So then this time of year, we're having more generative issues where the plants are getting generative because of those really high daytime temps, and the growing points are higher in the greenhouse. And so they're really, I should say too, the plant measures the temperature by that 20 centimeters below its growing point. So if the growing point is up high in the air in the greenhouse, it's going by the temperature up there. It's not going by the temperature that you feel, at chest height or whatever. So if your growing point is 6 feet in the air, then that's the temperature that the tomato is using to determine whether it's vegetative or generative. So keep that in mind. So yeah, this time of year, we're trying to increase the we're trying to lower the differential between night and day temps. We're side dressing with nitrogen, and we're watering a lot to try to increase, get them to be more vegetative and less generative. So for side dressing, we're doing weekly addition of nutrients. We use a high quality compost that we make ourselves here at the farm. It has like 4 different kinds of animal manure in it. We use a number of other things, but we really concentrate on making a high quality compost. And then we're mixing that compost as needed with additional amendments like sulfomag, bone char, kelp, sea salt, some sort of meal for nitrogen. Again, it depends on if we're trying to get more vegetative or generative, how much bone char or how much kelp meal or canola meal we're using. And we're just kind of changing it around. Also I highly recommend getting a soil test. You want what's called a saturated media soil test. That's different than a regular soil test. So I think I know UMass has them. I believe UVM has them as well. So get a saturated media test, and that'll tell you what you have for pH and what your levels are. Because these greenhouse tomatoes are much higher feeders than typical field crops. So that's why it needs a different test. And their greenhouse tomatoes are really heavy magnesium feeders and potassium feeders. So sulfomag, we're putting that in, that's sulfur, potassium, and magnesium. We're putting that in pretty much in every side dressing, and sometimes into the beds before we plant. And then our schedule is we just take 1 bucket of compost mixed with whatever amendment we need. And then we just walk down the aisle and we throw a handful on each spot where the drip is emitting some water. We do 1 line per bed per week. So like we'll do one side of the bed 1 week, and then the next week we're doing the other side of the bed. All right, pests and diseases. So on the left here, you can see this is probably one of the most typical things you'll see in greenhouse tomatoes. This is magnesium deficiency, or also potentially potassium. So the magnesium is kind of like that yellow in the middle of the leaves. That's usually typical of magnesium. The potassium is kind of a little more on the edges. Sometimes it's kind of hard to tell the difference because you're getting some yellowing there as well. But yeah, this is an indication that you need some more potassium, more magnesium. And also, this is a situation where we would get that plant, that leaf off there as soon as possible. Because although it is a nutrient issue, having this dead tissue here, it's not you're not going to have nutrient issues spreading to other plants. If you do have a nutrient issue with this plant, chances are the one next to it also has the same issue, but it's not, spreading from plant to plant per se. However, having a leaf in your greenhouse that is nutrient deficient leaves it much more susceptible to diseases. So you're much more likely to get bacterial disease infiltration or fungal disease on this leaf, or pests. They're attracted to less than healthy plant leaves, or sick plant leaves. So that's why you want to get this, this leaf out of there as soon as possible. So we'll break off that whole leaf and put it in a barrel. And then when we're done pulling off all the bad leaves, again, we're getting them out of there quarter-mile away from the greenhouse and getting them buried as soon as possible, because even after they're pulled off the plant, they're still alive. They can still be infected by fungus. And then, what funguses do is they just turn those leaves into spore factories. You can get millions of spores off a leaf this size if it gets infected by a fungal pathogen. And those spores are just exploding, and they're blowing around in the wind, blowing through your greenhouse, blowing into your field. Again, sanitation. It's really, really key for keeping your plants healthy. We don't spray anything in our greenhouse except compost tea. There are a number of organic fungicides and pesticides available. However, so we don't use them because two reasons. The main thing is that even though they're organic, they're still typically owned by the same chemical, industrial, agricultural companies that produce the more toxic fungicides and pesticides, like Dow Agro or Bayer, or I guess maybe they merged. I don't know, but we don't want to be supporting those big industrial companies. So that's the main reason we don't use it. Also, we find in general that the pests and diseases, they're more indicative of a fertility or a management issue. So they're really just Band-Aids. They're not an answer. They're just a temporary solution to a problem that you need to, a more systemic problem that you need to address. And so, it's kind of like a crutch for us. So if we can, if we just, I think I see a lot of times where growers are using those organic fungicides and pesticides as a crutch or a Band-Aid to fix an immediate problem they're facing, instead of addressing the underlying issue, which is, most likely it's fertility and management. Not having the right nutrients in the soil, not having enough biology in your soil or health in your soil, not watering correctly, having the plants spaced too closely, using improper variety, not heating properly, not ventilating properly. If you're doing all those things correctly, you shouldn't have really, or you're pruning at the right time and you're removing any issues when they do come up like that, then you don't have to do any spraying. We do the compost tea as kind of like a health supportive thing, but not as a reactionary response to some sort of disease or pest issue. And then on the right here, you have the biggest pest issue, usually, which is aphids. And so this, I will say, is from a plant that we bought in. I won't throw the farm under the bus, but you do want to be very careful of who you're buying from, and what the pest and disease problems are on that farm. So we got these plants in, and they had whiteflies and they had aphids. The grower told us, and everyone else said, "Oh, spray them! You got to spray the hell out of them for the first 2 weeks, and be careful." And we just the ones that were really bad like this, that is called epinasty. When they get curled up like that, it can be caused by plants. It can be caused by pests, or it can also, just a side note here, if you see your plant's starting to do this, especially at the growing point, and you don't see any pests on them, then a lot of times that's caused by ethylene. And that means ethylene could be caused by fossil fuels not being burnt completely. And so check your heating system. I've seen that happen where the whole greenhouse started getting like this on the growing points. The flowers started falling off the trusses before they turned into fruits. And it turned out the problem was a bumblebee had crawled up into the jet in the propane heater, and it wasn't burning completely, and it was spewing ethylene gas into the greenhouse at night and ruining the tomato crop. So that's a little side that, you know, pests and diseases aren't always caused by living organisms. Sometimes it is a I guess they call it a physical issue, like, you know, when ethylene gas or, you know, too cold temperatures or too warm temperatures. So, you know, don't always, you know, sometimes you have to think outside the box if you're having an issue like this. But back to the pests, you know, whiteflies and aphids are the two big ones we see on greenhouse tomatoes. I find that typically the aphids are caused by over fertilization with nitrogen. You have too much nitrogen available in the soil solution. You're relying on soluble nitrogen for your nitrogen instead of having more insoluble nitrogen or nitrogen that's available through organic matter or through biological activity. You know, because the plant, when you have nitrogen in solution, the plant really doesn't have a choice as to how much nitrogen it can uptake, because it needs to uptake water, a certain amount of water to live. And if there's an X amount of nitrogen in that water, the plant's going to take up that much nitrogen because it has no choice. It's in the water. But if you have less water soluble nitrogen in the soil, the plant is going to interact with the soil microorganisms in such a way as to get just the right amount of nitrogen that it needs. You know, if it needs more nitrogen, it's going to start making more sugars, putting those sugars into the roots, and those sugars in the roots are going to attract more fungi and more bacteria that will make the nitrogen. If it needs less nitrogen, it's going to start making less sugar, and there will be less nitrogen available for it to uptake. So, you know, it's a management issue that causes those aphids. And if you just go and spray them, you know, you're going to just be in that rut where you have to keep spraying to deal with them until you deal with the underlying systemic management issue. Whiteflies, we find the biggest cause of them is improper spacing. You don't have, the plants are too close. Also, so, you know, you're not pruning enough, you're not getting enough ventilation underneath. And they just, like, you know, they'll build up and become an issue. We also, that can also, in some instances, it can be a varietal thing. We found some varieties, just the whiteflies love them. And, you know, there'll be another variety right next to it that has no whiteflies on it. And there's one variety that just the whiteflies like. And, you know, the biggest whitefly issue I've had was on a greenhouse that was, like, you know, 8 feet tall, and it had almost no ventilation. So it's really all about ventilation. I'm just going to skip back real quick to this picture where you can see this is also a great instance of the ventilation. So, you know, there's a good 6 feet of airspace above the plants, and then there's also, you know, 3 feet underneath. So that wind and the air can really flow through there really well and dry things out. You avoid disease issues, avoid pest issues. And also, I guess I should have mentioned it earlier, but we also use ventilation fans in the greenhouse. I think that's really important, especially if you're growing early in the season and your greenhouse is closed for most of the day. You absolutely have to have ventilation fans to keep that air moving around, or you're going to run into serious pest and disease issues. So yeah, that's about what I have to say about those things. You know, again, the fungal issues can come in when you're not, you can see these water droplets coming off of the hydothodes, which are the organs on the edge of the plant leaf that allow water to come out if the pressure builds up too much. And if you don't have a way of drying those out and getting them off the plant leaf, then you're going to have fungal disease issues. So that's where ventilation is key, having ventilation fans or roll-up sides, and having that east to west wind, being able to dry those water droplets off of the hydrothodes before they become a vector for fungal disease. So final slide here, we have the harvest. You know, the nice thing about the greenhouse tomatoes is they come out really uniform, nice and red, no cracking. We like to harvest them with the stem and the leaf on there because, you know, you get that contrast of green to red, makes them look a little more alive, a little, you know, fresher pretty much. It's a little harder to harvest them with the stem on, but I think it does kind of set them apart. You know, we harvest them into these little wooden boxes, and then that way we're displaying them in that same wooden box because, you know, the less you handle the tomatoes, the better. So if you can harvest them into the box and then you bring them to market in that box and then you just set out the box on your display, and you're not, you know, transferring them from crate to crate or crate to table or whatever, they get less beat up. And, you know, that's especially important with the heirlooms because they're so valuable and so thin-skinned compared, you know, these are Geronimos where they're a lot more, you know, they have a thicker skin, they hold up a lot better to handling and whatnot. So yeah, that's what we have here. I think we do go to 8:30, correct? Yeah, so
That's right, Chuck.
yeah, I actually did all right and left enough time for questions. And yeah, so I'll open up to any questions people have or comments or ideas or tips, things that I didn't cover that you may know that I do not. I would love to hear anything like that.
If you'd like to ask a question to Chuck, you can unmute yourself with the mute in the bottom left-hand corner of your Zoom screen, or you can send it to the chat. Chuck, are you pruning the cherry tomatoes the same way that you prune the slicers?
Yes, yep, we're pruning cherries the same way, 2 liters. We don't prune the fruit clusters, obviously, because you want as many as you can get. But yeah, same pruning technique. Same thing with the heirlooms too. We're doing 2 liters. And yeah, I'm not sure if I touched on it too much, but with the heirlooms, we stopped grafting because we just did not see, we didn't see really much of an increase in yield, and we saw an increase in disease problems. So I think that's one of those things. And also I feel like the flavor wasn't as good. You know, where the management issue, changing our management practice seemed to get rid of our disease issue. I think that rootstock is just too high charge for the heirlooms, and the heirlooms, they just can't handle, you know, the amount of nutrients and water that the rootstocks were pumping into them.
Richard, do you have a question?
Thanks, Richard Robinson here. In Andrew Mefford's book and his presentations, I think he recommends a much higher density of plants. The way I read it, it looks as though he was planting them every foot. Unless I've got that wrong, what do you think about that, and what's the difference, and why are you both successful?
Perhaps he's talking about liters per foot. Yeah, I meant to peruse through his book quickly before doing this workshop, but I had lent it to our greenhouse manager and forgot to get it back. But I'm pretty sure he recommends the same spacing, but sometimes they go off of liters per foot. So yeah, maybe you could double check that for me. Or another thing too is possibly he's just doing 1 liter per plant, in which case you would want a plant every foot. So it's all about liters per square foot, not necessarily plants per square foot. And we found that having 2 liters per plant, you're still getting plenty of nutrients, and it's you know, you only have to buy or graft half as many plants. So that would be the reason to not do you know, twice as many plants and just do 1 liter. But perhaps if you have soil, you know, maybe if you have fertility issues, you might be getting more fertility by having twice as many root systems when you do a single liter. So that might be a reason to do that. But yeah, I wish I could double check that. But you know, I was at a farm. I worked at a farm for a year at a friend's farm, and they insisted on growing the plants every, there's like 2 plants per, or 2 rows per bed, and then 2 liters per plant. And like by the end of it, you had like a liter every 9 inches, and 2 rows per bed like that. And it was just a total mess. You couldn't get in there. You couldn't harvest. All the fruits were really small. I think I'm 98% sure that's the way to go. But I would love to hear if someone else had more success with a different situation.
Thanks.
There's another question about hand wiping or washing tomatoes before you go to market.
I think that's probably personal preference. I wipe them by hand, just wipe off kind of the dust a little bit. And mainly my thinking with that is that I don't want to have to handle them anymore, because each time you handle them, you're getting a little more bruising, a little more loss. Plus it's just more work. And so I kind of brush them off and put them in the box. And then, the next person that touches them is the customer. And so that way you reduce the amount of bruising them. But, if you're particularly concerned about, ideally they're off the ground, so you're not running into food safety issues. But if you do have that, you can wash them, or, they do tend to shine up a little bit better if you run some water over them. So, I think it all just comes down to your market and your, how much labor you have. If you have the time to wash them all, and, you feel like you're setting yourself apart from the vendor in the next booth or whatever by having these, bright, shiny tomatoes, then maybe it's worth it.
There's a question about compost tea for tomatoes. Do you make it?
Yeah, we make it. We use a handful of our own compost. We add a little bit of kelp. And sometimes we put a little apple cider vinegar in after we mix it. But I'm trying to think, kelp. I feel like there's one more. I haven't made it in so long. I'm forgetting an ingredient, I think. But at least compost, because that is the inoculant. That's where all their microorganisms come from. The kelp is kind of like a substrate for the microorganisms to live on while they're multiplying, and also to kind of have, that, like, you get more microorganisms if you have more substrate for them to live on inside the compost tea. And then we just have it in a bucket with one of those fish tank aerators. You want to have it in there for about 3 days. If you have it not in there long enough, then you don't get the buildup of microorganisms. If you have it in there too long, they're starting to die off because they've used up all their energy, and they kind of, you have this boom and then bust sort of situation, like in any population ecology. And seems like 3 days is the peak time when you want to be spraying that compost tea. And then we pull it out, strain it, add a little apple cider vinegar, and spray it on the plants. You also want to spray in the evening so that you don't, sometimes you can have burning. And also they seem to absorb, it gives them more time to absorb the compost tea rather than having it just evaporate off the leaves if you spray it in the morning or in the midday.
And do you utilize any companion planting for the tomatoes in the greenhouse?
We don't. However, that's probably, I'm sure that's probably a good idea to have some companion plants in there. Do beware of growing other plants in your greenhouse tomato, in your tomato greenhouse, that can be vectors or, hideaways for other diseases. Like we grew some flowers in the greenhouse this year, and there was a lot of thrips on them. And so some of the tomatoes that were next to the flowers got a little bit of thrips on them. We've never had a major issue with thrips. They kind of go away on their own. But, if you're growing a lot of flowers and you have thrips issues, maybe you want to separate them into different greenhouses. We've also had an issue where we had a lot of white flies on we had basil, and they got a white fly issue. And then all the tomatoes that were next to the basil got majorly infested with white flies. We do now grow basil next to the tomatoes without an issue by changing our management practices, having more ventilation and whatnot, and we haven't had an issue. But there are other things that can be an issue growing next to the tomatoes. So just, be cautious and think about those things before planting them.
can you talk a little bit more, Chuck, about your compost production?
Yeah, I'd love to. So yeah, we're finally really getting our act together with the compost. So we have cows, sheep, chickens, and pigs on the farm. And so all three of those animal manures are going into it. We'd love to get some horse manure, get some, although I don't want to deal with horses right now, but I think that would be, biodynamics says that that's really the best manure. But you know, having a mix of manures, you get that a mix of different nutrients, which is great. Also a mix of different microorganisms. So I think that's great. And then most of that manure is mixed in with some sort of bedding material, either wood chips or straw or hay. And so that is our carbon source. So that's another key component. And then also, you know, all our vegetative matter, like when we're pruning or when we're pulling out plants to switch, you know, turn the bed over to something else, those are going in the compost as well. So, you know, just having diversity. We're still not at the point yet where we're putting biodynamic preps in there because we're working on making our own. But I think having some biodynamic preps in there would make a huge difference. You know, sometimes we try to just do it the easy way and throw some handfuls of chamomile or horse nettle or whatever in the compost. But yeah, biodynamic preps I think would go a long way. And then we just started getting spent grain from a local brewery, which is a very high source of nitrogen. And then to counteract that, we're adding leaves that are biodegraded for a year or two and wood chips that have also been sitting for a year or two to kind of counteract the high nitrogen in the spent grain. And so getting all that mixed together, we've been getting pretty nice stuff. We just recently got a grant from MDAR for a compost turner, and that's been revolutionary, being able to really aerate that pile and mix it in and mix it together really well. It's so much better than turning it with a bucket of a tractor. That seems to have made a huge difference. And then, you know, just monitoring the compost. We've got a compost thermometer, so we're checking the temperatures, trying to get it to the right temperature, you know, not only so that we can apply it as official compost through organic standards, but also just to find out what's going on. Is it too high in nitrogen? If it's really hot, you have too much nitrogen. If it's really cold, then you're not getting enough nitrogen, or maybe there's too much water in there. You know, you got to get just the right amount of water, you know, not too dry, not too wet. You know, I use the compost thermometer, but I'm also going out there picking up handfuls of compost, smelling it, you know, poking through it with my hands, seeing what's in there. If you see a lot of mycelium in there, that's a good sign. You see a lot of life in there, that's a good sign, I think. Yeah, I think basically the more things you can get in your compost, the more diverse your substrate for your compost, the better. The more you can turn it in the initial phases, the better. Just the more attention and the more love, the more attention and intention you give to your compost pile, the better, I think. You know, I hate to get hippy dippy, but you know, your vibes when you're working on your compost pile, they're going into that compost pile and they're going to be spread on your field. You're inoculating your fields with your, there's a good way to inoculate your whole field with your good vibes is by putting them into your compost pile. And you know, that's a good way too, to just inoculate all your fields with microorganisms as well. Yeah.
Great, Chuck. Thanks for that explanation. I'm going to give you another question here from Patrick. Given that tomatoes are a high revenue crop, is it better to value add, make sauce, or focus on just the tomatoes?
I think just the tomatoes. We used to make sauce and we did the math. It takes about 4 pounds of tomatoes to make a jar of tomato sauce that we were selling for, I think we raised the price to like $12 or $14, which people think is outrageous, but 4 pounds of tomatoes, we're getting $6 a pound retail. That's $24. So you're putting $24 worth of tomatoes into a jar of sauce, and then you're spending a lot of time, you know, getting a recipe approved for your tomatoes, jarring them, kitchen time, all that really adds up. So I think much more value in selling them fresh, That being said, if you have lots of time and you happen to have a commercial kitchen that you have access to really cheaply and you like doing it, it can be a good outlet for your seconds. But I think really I think there's much more money selling them fresh.
Great, that's great. Anybody have any last questions for Chuck before we call it a night?
I do have one. Can you hear me? Probably not.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Once you get, I've got a terrible problem with gray mold in the house that I grew tomatoes in. Any way to get it out, or am I doomed?
I don't know the specifics on gray mold. Do you know, does it need plant material to overwinter, or do the spores go on the ground?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Do you know if the spores need living plant material to live, or are they something that overwinter in the ground?
I don't. I assume that they're ubiquitous and perennial. I don't know.
Yeah, so I'd look into that first, because there are, some funguses need living plant material to live, and so those are a lot easier to deal with. And so, because sometimes it's something that's, you start off the year without it, and then it's being introduced somehow. So yeah, check into that, and then if it is something that's ubiquitous in the soil, really rotating and I think getting more biological activity in your soil will help, because if you have enough good microorganisms in the soil, they're gonna, and maybe enough earthworms really, they're gonna be eating a lot of those spores, just by chance. They're gonna be running through the soil, eating everything in their path, and they'll over time eat a lot of those spores up, reduce your spore load. And then really with all the fungal diseases, it's all about ventilation, and getting those, all those funguses need a specific leaf wetness duration to germinate. And so if you can keep your leaves dry as much as possible, you're going to keep them from being able to germinate. So, having that big spacing, that's also maybe where more spacing could come in handy. And then is this a heated greenhouse or unheated?
Unheated.
Yeah, it's a little trickier to manage it, because you can't, in the morning, if you have heated, you turn on that heater and you crank it for a little bit and it dries out all the air. So yeah, I would say work on the ventilation. What kind of ventilation do you have?
Roll up sides and peak vents.
Okay, wow. So yeah, so that's, the best scenario really. Yeah, I think maybe more spacing and maybe think about ventilation or circulation fans within the greenhouse. And then also actually variety. Now that I think about it too, I believe, because we had leaf mold on when we were doing Arbison. That was another reason we stopped doing the Arbison varieties, because they were very susceptible to leaf mold. And then we switched to Geronimo and we have no issues at all. So yeah, I'd look into the more resistant varieties.
Thanks.
No problem.
Okay, thank you so much. This has been a great presentation, Chuck. I know that everybody probably enjoyed it. And I want to thank Chuck and all of you for participating in the NOFA Mass virtual summer conference for the first time this year. And for those of you that would like to visit the vendor page, it was shared in the chat. You can buy books there. You can support our vendors. There's also a raffle, our traditional teacup raffle. You will still see online. So take advantage of all of those sites. And we hope to see you again on Friday or on Wednesday, excuse me, Wednesday and Friday for our next installment of the NOFA virtual summer conference. So thank you again, Chuck. It was a great presentation, and those look like some great tomatoes.
Awesome. All right. Thank you guys so much, and happy growing. Have a great season.
Thank you.